Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. This video is going to be a little different from my normal videos because I'm going to talk a little more generally about my style of photography. Now that's going to be meaningless if you've not seen any of my images and you have no idea what my style is. The video can only really have any benefit if you feel my photography does have some merit. If you didn't, then what would be the point? What I'll do is I'll link below to my Flickr gallery so you can take a look should you wish to, but I'll also put up one or two images here as I speak, and I think that's going to be far better than me talking to camera. So how interesting will this video be? Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure. But I like to compare what I do to other photographers, especially on YouTube, so I can pick up any ideas that I've missed. It's also quite nice to have your ideas confirmed, when they are of course, by someone else whose images you rate highly. So here goes. I'm an amateur photographer. I've never earned my living from photography, and that was a conscious decision that I made many years ago when I was in my early 30s. I wanted to keep my photography as a hobby, and I've largely done that for well over 40 years now. My proper job was in transport in London, which I've now retired from. I have earned some money from my teaching of Photoshop via magazines and online discs, particularly in the earlier digital days, but nothing that could be called a living. All my content on my website and YouTube is free. I consider myself an all-round photographer with no preference for one subject or another, but I do live on the coast of a pretty nice part of Australia, so seascapes and landscapes will obviously feature quite strongly. One thing you may notice is you won't see a lot of people pictures amongst the images that I shoot and produce. One or two maybe, and sometimes I produce them just a little bit different. I'm not entirely sure why, it's just a subject that doesn't seem to float my boat. I don't use any filters at all at the taking stage apart from a polarizing filter on occasions, because I can't replicate the effects of a polarizer in Photoshop. I'm also not interested in filters to protect the front glass on my lenses. I've had a multitude of lenses over the past 45 years and I've never damaged one yet. In situations where some photographers would reach for a graduated filter at the taking stage to lower the brightness of one part of their scene, I use exposure bracketing and Photoshop to achieve the same results. My personal view is this: why pay for expensive graduated filters, carry them around in your camera bag, and then have to apply them in locations where sometimes it can become a bit tricky, in rain for example, or when you're on a beach. Exposure bracketing meets all my needs, and I've developed the Photoshop skills to edit my images fairly quickly, and I feel it's a more versatile way of working too. I've rarely found the need to blend exposures so precisely that I have turned to luminosity masks. Now I suspect they may be more of a niche area of editing, and they're probably a little more trouble than they're worth, especially for amateur photographers. So why do I single out amateurs here? It's because generally speaking, amateurs don't use these techniques often enough to become fully proficient with them. And if we're not careful, we can find ourselves chasing techniques as if they are the holy grail, when a KISS principle may be a better approach. However, these days I'm careful never to rule anything out completely. I'm always willing to be proved wrong. Quality photography is what drives me, and it always has. If you see an image of mine posted, you're probably going to be viewing most, if not all, of the pixels that were originally captured by my camera. That's because I tend to do my cropping and composing in camera at the taking stage for the vast majority of my images. Now, that approach has cost me images at times, I will admit, because if you go in too close with some subjects, the potential for depth of field issues and camera shake is much greater. I've had a few disappointing results with this filling the frame approach, but overall, composing in camera has been a positive thing for my photography, definitely not a negative one. Now, I'm not opposed to cropping an image, but if I had to crop to, let's say, a quarter of the pixels my camera captured to get a frame filling shot, I would consider that a little bit of a failure on my part. Now, is that an entirely rational view, given that the majority of our images are displayed digitally? Probably not, and my quest to constantly fill the frame could very easily be argued with. But it's the approach that pleases me, and it's what drives my enthusiasm and my inspiration. Now, while I'm concentrating here on filling the frame and image quality, and the next topic I'd like to talk about is the software, I should say at this point that I almost never sharpen images. I haven't done so for probably at least 10 years. Once my camera has reached a point where I could capture 20 million pixels in the sensor, I haven't found the need. I'm a user of Photoshop rather than Lightroom, but the reasons for that are purely historical. I was introduced to Photoshop in the early 90s, just a few years after its launch. Photoshop, of course, is now 31 years old, so by the time that Adobe created Lightroom, I was already an established user of Photoshop. Photoshop and Lightroom are both great editing programs, and what you choose is a personal choice, of course. I see it rather like driving different cars. No matter what model we drive, we all get to the same places in more or less the same amount of time. One thing that's vital to my workflow is my Wacom graphics tablet. It's a must-have for me, and I've been using one now for over 20 years. It makes the workflow when we're editing quick and easy. All I would say is, if you've ever tried signing your name on screen with a mouse and then with a pen, well, I rest my case. I use a Windows-based computer, but once again, it's for historical reasons. When I was first introduced to Photoshop in those early days of digital, I was a PC user, and I've just stayed with them. My other interest at the time was digital audio-visual, and the better software for that was Windows-based. If for some reason I had to change to an Apple Mac, it wouldn't impact my editing at all, because it's just the same as software. It would be like changing my car from a Toyota to a Ford. Give me a week to get used to it, that's all I'd need. I'm a Canon user, and that dates back from when I went from a Canon EOS 5 film camera to the D30, which was Canon's first digital SLR. I already had Canon lenses, so it made sense to stay with Canon, and I've been with them ever since. I've only ever changed my entire camera system once, and that's been in the past year, and it's now October 2021. I've stayed with Canon, but I've changed to the mirrorless system, including a range of new RF lenses. And I suppose a good question would be, why did I do that? Photography is my only passion, and a shocking illness and death close to me recently caused me to take stock of my life, particularly in my senior years. A friend of mine began using the Lumix G9 and I found myself quite impressed with the mirrorless system, so I opted for the Canon R5. The 45 megapixel sensor also met my enthusiasm for quality photography and of course along with the mirrorless technology. So along with the Canon R5 I've added the following lenses. A 24 to 105mm zoom, which more or less is a standard lens on the camera. A 15 to 35mm lens, which is great for those seascapes and landscapes. But I also have the 100 to 500mm zoom. But just recently I've also added the 70 to 200 f2.8. Now I have to admit that this lens is pure indulgence, as it does cover the focal length range I already had with the other lenses. But it's a 2.8 lens and it's quite small by comparison to lenses that are usually in that range. And it's a very nice lens to use and carry. Having said all that, what camera we use is not as vital as we think. It's nice to have good equipment, but all I would say is good things come to those who wait. I shoot almost exclusively aperture priority, which meets 99% of my needs. As I've already mentioned, in most lighting conditions I'll use exposure bracketing, and I do that for a number of reasons. Now the first of those I think is exposure confidence. Nice to be able to go home and know you've got a good image to work on. But when we bracket our exposures, we find that we have more options later on the computer. Do we use one frame or two, or maybe combine all three into a HDR? We do have some options. I also use automatic exposure bracketing because it speeds up working, and sometimes that can be important when you're shooting dawn and dusk and you've only got a few minutes to grab some images before the light changes. And I think for just peace of mind and fewer errors. And lastly, it costs nothing. The vast majority of my editing is now done in Adobe Camera Raw, and most people will know that that is virtually identical to Lightroom. But I generally finish off in Photoshop. I don't have a great need to do batch processing, but when I do, I use Photoshop's bridge to copy and paste Adobe Camera Raw settings from one image to another or to a batch of images. Many of the images you've been viewing here were shot with my Canon 20 megapixel 1DS Mark III, along with a series of Canon EF lenses. Most of that equipment is now gone and replaced with the Canon R5 and RF lenses. I do still have a couple of EF lenses remaining because another interest of mine is digital infrared photography via a converted 20 megapixel Canon 5D. I've got lots of information on my website about infrared, so let's not get into too much detail here. Once a camera is converted, which entails just the swapping of a filter in the camera body, infrared images can be shot handheld, and I use the Canon EF 17 to 40 lens on my infrared camera for most of the time. But sometimes I use a Canon EF 24 to 105 lens. The processing is very much the same as standard images, Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom and Photoshop. Black and white photography has always been a love of mine, probably dating back to my darkroom days, but an infrared camera does add an interesting and stimulating angle to photography. This is especially so when you consider the colour advancements in image editing like Photoshop. I never use presets in any of my photography, preferring to take care of the image editing on an individual image basis. However, I have become a fan of DxO's Nik filters over the years particularly their black and white filters in conjunction with my infrared images. I'll take my image manipulation as far as I can in Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. But when I get to an acceptable result, I'll see if I can take it just one step further, and I'll do that using the DxO Nik filters. Something I've forgotten to mention is that I'm a user of the back button focus method on all my cameras. Now, I don't want to elaborate on that here, but I'll link to a video on the subject below, but it is something that's worth looking at. My other photographic interest is digital audio visual via the software PTE AV Studio. We view most of our images these days on large monitors and huge flat screen televisions. If you can find a better way to display your photography than seeing your images set to music, then please let me know, because I can't find one. In my 40 plus years in photography, both film and digital, I have found nothing to compare with audio-visual. I'll link to one or two examples below, but there are lots more AVs on my website and tutorials on how to make them. I think I've talked enough, probably more than enough, so thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.